In the summer of 2020, it began with the racial violence similar to the assaults perpetuated during the summer of 1919, a period often referred to as Red Summer. Black people on horseback, born and raised in Compton, was a vivid show of the anti-racist force, June 9th, 2020. Black cowboys and cowgirls from Compton graced the pages of the New York Times under the headline Evoking History, Black Cowboys Take to the Streets. For people who grew up in the hub city, it was more of our reality, leaving the Afro-Frontier to occupy space in places like Southern California, Oakland, Harlem. To engage America's roaring 20s, Black cowboys continue to maintain a vibrant culture amongst themselves. A historical narrative sickness has concealed a brief period at the turn of the 20th century when Black people preserved their internal structures behind the Du Boisian veil of double consciousness. Now, think of this in terms of a narrative trajectory that is absent slavery as the main story, okay? This trajectory here, I want you to know, this is all the way where it says Prince Hall at the bottom, Revolutionary War, all the way to Kansas, all the way to Compton. So that's the trajectory I'm talking about right now. And that is the, okay. And that's linking it to the African diaspora. Blackdom was a real place located in the southeastern section of the New Mexico territory. The Afro-Frontier town was part of a Black colonization movement that operated on a continuum influenced by ministers, military men, and Black Freemasons. After the Plessy decision established the separate but equal doctrine, Black institutions evolved to take advantage by encouraging a separate and equal response. Blackdom was a real place that started with an inherited idea. The Afro-Frontier town manifested at the turn of the 20th century for African descendants under the conditions of American Blackness. The idea for Blackdom developed throughout the 19th century. In the 20th century, although Blackdom existed as a town for a brief moment, self-determination and how to achieve it were exemplified in the experiment. Significant to the Black and ambitious, Blackdom town site was a proof of concept for how to deliver on the promise of God's sovereignty. In practice, Blackdomites pooled land to build a 10,000 person all-Black municipality. At the core of their movement was the exploitation of land through the homestead process. In 1900, Black people totaled less than 200 in Chavez County and less than 2,000 in all of New Mexico, the territory. But all of Blackdomites were represented at the beginning of the colonization scheme. From the state of Washington to South Carolina, Blackdomites advertised the organization of an Afrotopia. And here is the ad in South Carolina. The Blackdom Townsite Company of Santa Fe, New Mexico was incorporated recently with a capital stock of 10,000. You can read the rest later. We can come back to that if you want. In the Santa Fe New Mexican, September 9th, 1903, It was reported that the Blackdom Townsite Company was incorporated, and they printed the articles of incorporation with the names of 13 men and their intentions. Isaac Jones, Blackdom Townsite Company's first vice president, began his homestead in April of 1903. In 1905, Isaac Jones became the first Blackdomite co-founder to complete a homestead. The basic process took 3 to 10 years. Here's what I want you to look at. This is the vice president of the Blackdom Townsite Company, and we'll get back to why this says no, sir. Limits of an incorporated town, and it says no, sir. We can get to that later. In 1909, after minimal participation in the colonization scheme, Blackdom was revived as a way to mitigate the impact of New Mexico's impending statehood and the shift from federal to local power. Blackdom's elite owned land, but owning land wasn't enough to realize their Afrotropic dreams. Located 20 miles south of Roswell, Blackdom was a small enclave of landowning Black people. Blackdomites needed a collective action to deliver on the promise of their intersection. And again, I want to recognize the Mescalero Reservation here. Blackdom was on reservation land, just to be clear. During Blackdom's revival, after 1909, Blackdom included the significant striving of Black women as they began participating in the homestead process more fully. Mattie Moore, Pernicia Russell, and Ella Boyer were a few who chose to engage the world as part of Blackdom's homestead class. Blackdom's growth intensified with the passage of the Homestead Enlargement Act of 1909. The township increased enough that Blackdomites organized a school and reached out to the territorial government for curriculum. This is a census of one of the main founders, Frank Boyer, and his family, and Daniel Keyes. Those two are legendary in the Blackdom narrative. Revival included educating the next generation by also projecting an intersectional Blackness from behind the Du Boisian veil. For 2 years, Harold Coleman, a newspaper ads man from back east, led the advertising campaign published in the Crisis magazine. Separate and equal, Blackdomites projected intentional Blackness and God's sovereignty. After a few privileged Black travelers reported back to the migrating ambitious Black masses, Blackdom became a beacon for the illuminated. In revival, Blackdom became a real place and more than a refuge. Blackdomites preferred farmers to city folk for the sake of increased production. Everyone was required to adjust to the steep learning curve of dry farming. The agricultural society was a community set on living by God's divine law of sowing and reaping. Seed time and harvest time were different on desert prairies, but the ambitious frontier scheme was refined into a process with predictable outcomes for investors. In 1914, as a signee for Mattie and Pernicia, Frank Boyer, Blackdom's first, Blackdom Townsite Company's first president, completed the land patent for Blackdom's 40-acre town square. As a part of the Illuminated, George Malone was admitted to the New Mexico bar and identified as the first Negro to do so. Blackdom's revival backdrop included the Mexican Revolution raging in the borderlands as the U.S. entered into World War. Pushed to the forefront, Black children were conscripted into military service. People under the conditions of Blackness, of American Blackness, patriotic to a separate but equal system, Blackdomites put the future of the small village on hold and shifted their activities 20 miles north into Roswell. Meanwhile, in Roswell, Mittie Moore went from famous to hypervisible to infamous as patriotism fueled the war effort. The new era became a rationalization for raids on her bawdy business at 201 South Virginia Ave. During the shift to Roswell, the image of Black people was under assault across the world. With D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, Black bodies were under constant threat in the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. In the Roswell Daily Record, Roswellian leaders advertised the showing of Birth of a Nation and offered lectures on Americanism, which was grooming before incorporation of a Klan chapter in the city. Mittie Moore Wilson became the antithesis of the new patriotic fervor of the citizen soldier. She occupied the Black female image in the region. Meanwhile, on July 21st, 1917, the Roswell Daily Record reported Ezel Ragsdale had been drafted from the unincorporated Afro-Frontier town, and the family prepared him for deployment, which included putting his homestead process on hold. The women of Blackdom did their part on a few fronts. One of their major tasks was to diversify the Black female image in Chavez County. There we go. The women of Blackdom hosted an inter-ethnic bandage knitting party a few times for the troops on the front line. Curiously, the women of Blackdom staged the intersectional gathering in the window on Main Street. Nevertheless, in the fall of 1917, Guilt Not Found, okay, that's the title there, Guilt Not Found. Nevertheless, Mittie led the headlines on trial for attempted murder of her fiancé. John Wilson aggravated her enough that she pulled out her revolver and shot 2 holes in his coat, missing him completely. The police thought they had her, but she got off. And next month she was on trial again for her bawdy business. Mittie was on the margins of Blackdom society, and Blackdom's women were on her periphery. Mittie stayed unaffiliated prior to 1919, even though she began a homestead in 1915, 3 miles south of Blackdom Town Square. She needed witnesses to vouch for her homestead progress under the threat of federal perjury charges. The new Blackdom leadership that came in, the soldiers who came back from war, the new Blackdom leadership legitimized her claim. In the spring of 1922, Mittie completed her final homestead proof. A whole square mile. And by the summer, Blackdomites sold their church, and the town faithful migrated outward. Ella and half the Boyer family, which was kind of the founding family, moved to Vado. Although there was an exodus from Blackdom after 1919, the town business was stronger than ever. The next generation took over as America entered the roaring 20s in post-war euphoria. December 31st, 1919, the Roswell Daily Record reported Will Pool acreage. Blackdomites incorporated the Blackdom Oil Company and set the agricultural society on a path towards oil exploration. That is the quick, fast, and in a hurry trajectory. Are there any questions currently? I can always go back and begin the in-depth conversation, but are there any questions up front? I know you all are muted right now. No questions? Okay. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back. Now, if you go to Wikipedia and you read the narrative that they have there, the basis for it is that Black people were motivated by the violence, or they were pushed, pulled. That's the conversation that is normally takes place in conversations about Black migration, and it usually begins with slavery. So what I do to diversify that particular backstory for Black towns, I begin with Prince Hall and Bishop Richard Allen. And the reason I do is because they represent the triad where I speak about intersectional Blackness. So first imagine Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. All three of them in the same town working together where they can. That is the intersectional Blackness that I try to describe. And it begins with these two, because Bishop Richard Allen, he split away from the Episcopal Church and created the AME Church. Prince Hall broke away from Freemasonry, for white Freemasonry, and created Black Freemasonry. And so within those two institutions, you had Black military men. So at church, you had military men, ministers, and Freemasons. And that is the triad that creates the trajectory for the 19th century. So if we go to, I'm going to show you one more. Let me see. I can go on forever with this. I'll give you an example. Okay. So this was the inaugural church for the African Methodist Episcopal. And loyalists are the ones that you can also see. So here's the military men who went to Nova Scotia, and they all came together around Ethiopianism, or the belief in a free Black people and a long past before. So the ideas of Ethiopianism, liberation theology, and so on, they were nurtured, and then it produced a colonization movement that you can see directly leading to Liberia and the American Colonization Society and so on. So you have the establishment of Liberia, and then you have Liberian independence. And you can tell 1847 is pretty important. So with the U.S.-Mexico War end, you also had a independent Liberia, which represented Black excellence and the decolonization and all of the different terms that we have now. So you also have the creation of Buffalo Soldiers. After that, and we can go much further into that, that is when you get Blackdom, because, let me see if I can get closer. Yes. Okay, so the people inside of this square, so at the biggest picture is Henry Boyer. He was the first born into slavery. Aggie Boyer was his mother, who was born in Africa and brought into slavery 1820s. Okay, so while they were establishing Liberia, there was also slavery happening in this Boyer family here in what we call the U.S. And right underneath Boyer and Ella, those two became pretty much the founding families, but there were 13 families altogether. But these are the ones because this Frank Boyer was a Buffalo soldier, he was a minister, and he was a Freemason. So he was a minister, he was trained at Morehouse, and he taught at Fisk. And he was a Buffalo soldier. He was in the 24th Infantry. He helped lay out Fort Huachuca in Arizona, and a few other. He was in. He mentions a couple of the what I call genocides that he was a part of, or fighting, Indian fighting, however you want to phrase it. And that's a part of his legacy. Before he gets to Blackdom, he leaves Buffalo Soldier service, goes back to Georgia, marries, and then heads to back to the Southwest. Now, you're not going to hear that story because most people will want to tell you that Boyer was supposedly pushed into finding his promised land because the Klan was after him and because of a lynching. If you read in Wikipedia, I don't really bother with that story, so sometimes I get it wrong. But one story says he was there when a black barber nicked a white man, and so then the white man killed the barber, and then the Ku Klux Klan. It's a whole convoluted story that didn't happen because I found an article in 1947, 2 years before Boyer passed away, where he said, "Oh no, in the county that I grew up in, there wasn't a single lynching." So he had never seen one. So the story they created was what I have deduced to thinking is that it's from the Exoduster narrative. And so that's where bringing in Prince Hall and Bishop Allen and talking about the trajectory helps people to really understand Blackdom in its fullness. Because this right here, let me back out again. This can be confused. Oh, gosh. Okay. This one right here says Negro colonization scheme. Do it slow. And this is 1903. This is the 1903 ads. And a lot of times they would talk about a Negro refuge. And so they did market themselves as if it was a refuge. However, you can see quickly they found out that city folk and dry farming don't mix well. There was too much that could happen, and in the beginning, a lot of people failed. Had a hard time. I can mention Crutcher Eubank as one of them, and then after that you have for all of 1920, and you can see all of the. I have collected all of the ads for Blackdom in the 1920s, and they're all on my website, blackdomthesis.com. And they printed this for the first half of 1920 after they pulled their acreage. And then by June, you could see that there were contracts in place. And then let me just go to Boom Times. You have Blackdom location made September 1st, 1920. And it was a California syndicate. Now, why am I mentioning the California syndicate now? Because if I take you back to the beginning, that's how these guys, the ones that were in cowgirls, cow guys and cowgirls, all are here. These are They're from Compton. And friends of mine. I played football with some of them. Well, maybe not all of them right there, but I played football with some of them. This is California. This is Southern California with horses in the middle of the line. Now, the reason why most people had never heard of them is because most of the time their culture maintains within itself. There's not a lot of outside except when they go to school or church or something like that. But other than that, not so much. So that's the end of the presentation part. Is there anything anyone wants to go over right now? Anything catch your eye that you would like more information on?
So
I don't see the let me see questions here. Can you see the questions? If you can't, can you rattle them off?
Let me. So you want to? Shall we move on to the question?
Yeah. I'm done with the presentation part. I can go back to specific places.
Okay. All right. Let's see what we got here. So, Dr. McNabb has a question, and she's asking: aside from the newspaper accounts, can you talk about other chief sources of your work, outlining some of the methods you use to analyze your evidence?
Oh yes. Okay. So.
And then we have another one already set up after her.
Okay. So, besides newspaper articles, I went to census records. That is what gave me the basics for understanding what population and them being ignored. Here's another one here. Okay. So I took the census records. I started there. Then I used, let's see, homestead records. These right here told me the story, because if you look, it says Isaac Jones, and they have questions, and he answers them, okay? And this is blurry because I wasn't expecting to go there, but I'll go here. Okay, so for example, this right here creates an amazing story because it says, is your present claim within the limits of an incorporated town or selected site of a city or town, or used in any way for trade and business? No, sir. And this is for Isaac Jones, Blackdom Townsite Company's first vice president. And that was in 1903. That's why I consider it the lost years. So the homestead records was able to fill in what happened in that first decade. Because if you look at any other narrative, it starts around 1908, or sometimes I've even seen one start in 1916. And the reason is because of that thing where there's no one that was necessarily connected to Blackdom, although Frank Boyer, for example, used the fact that he was the president of the Townsite Company to as credibility in order for him to get a mechanical pump for the homestead that he was on. So he had letterhead that said president of the exclusive Negro town, and then he wrote the letter to the pump makers, and then he finally got his pump. So although there was that kind of thing with the homestead records filling it in, that was one of the main ones. And then for MIDI, I used a lot more of her articles because it kind of gave me a sense of how Blackdomites saw her, because they would not have necessarily known her. They would have just known she's not like the church folk we are. So I used a lot of newspapers with her. She has homestead records too as well. I don't go into her homestead in the presentation, but yes, she has homestead records too. Also, one of the things that was helpful is, believe it or not, because Roswell was on the cutting edge, they had a phone book. So you can go through at least 2 decades of phone books and see where people lived in Roswell. Let's see, homestead records, courthouse record. Oh, I almost forgot the best. Okay. I got to show you this one. Now I'm excited. Now I'm the historian. Okay. I even have a picture of it. So At the bottom shelf right here in the archive, I found this. And let me tell you, this is a police judge docket from the Wild West quote, and it has all of the police reports for MIDI. So I did it. So before it went to the newspaper, I looked at the long version of it, and it's pretty interesting. And you can see their pay and all of this other stuff. So police judge docket. Let's see. Yeah, the archive, the Southeastern Historical Society had a lot of those. Now, I did use some oral history, but not to necessarily write the history, just to understand how the memory of it has come about. Because I wanted to write a new story, I needed to know that too. But yeah, those were the main pieces. Let me see. Oh, there were translated oral interviews with a few of the descendants, obituaries, but again, that's newspaper. But yeah.
Okay, so the next question is from Dr. Cheryl Dong, who is our recently hired public historian, and she is asking, do you think of Blackdom as an example of Black nationalism? What, if any, connections have you found to Garveyism, for example? Also, can you speak to social class in terms of how did they relate to Black respectability?
Okay. Okay. This is the question that deals with what I call intersectional Blackness. So, class. There was a large educated class when it came to Blackdom. I mentioned Boyer. I mentioned Malone. Malone was the first Black man to uh, um, appear before the Supreme Court of New Mexico. That was brand new. That had just started in 1912. So there was a class, but you can get over it as a member of Blackdom Church or part of the Masonic Lodge. So that's where class came into play. However, the one thing that was difficult for Blackdomites to have in their society was alcohol. So if you go to 1927, there's an article that Blackdomites wrote to other Black people in Roswell. Well, it sounds like it, and it's kind of petty to be. It's pretty nice. So it's Juneteenth, right? And since this last Juneteenth, everyone is pretty much aware what Juneteenth is about. They decided there would be zero alcohol. We are enforcing the Volstead Act, and there will be preaching. There will be a lesson by the pastor, Pastor Eubank. So I imagine that the pastor wrote it. So there was a class situation, and when oil came into play, it changed the nature of Blackdom. So the Blackdom faithful, again, some of them, well, half of the Boyer family definitely, moved to Vado and created a whole new Black colony in Vado. In fact, their families still gather there. They've been gathering there since the 1970s. So there was a class issue, even to the point where I suggest that it's what ended the colonization scheme and marshaled in the new oil exploration decade in the 1920s.
All right. So, Tim, yeah, I really enjoyed this. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the way you're talking about the history of Black institutions. And so it seems to me one of the things you're saying is that it's a new way of looking at the development of a place like Blackdom is to go back in history to institution building, even within the period of slavery instead of sort of seeing the whole pre-1865 period as sort of amorphous slavery, as if there, and that you're bringing up the institution building that happened during that time. And could you just elaborate on how that is different from the sort of standard narrative a little bit more?
The standard narrative doesn't allow for anything other than a push and pull. So in the push out is because of white violence and economic disaster and all of the things that we can talk about. The pull was, oh, there's a job in the Midwest, and so I'm going to travel up the Mississippi or something, or I'm going to. Yeah, that's basically the only conversation that's going on. So when we start at a time when you can see institutions in the 1700s that you can see in Frank Boyer, it allows us to look at slavery as an interruption. So I look at this trajectory as from sovereignty to sovereignty. So sovereign Black people in Africa interrupted by slavery, and then on a continuum to reach sovereignty anyway. And so the colonization mantra also carries on into Black cowboys who are in Compton, who kind of existed under the radar for most people, if not everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cutter. Next question is from Dr. Ann Horup. Hope I said that correctly. What types of businesses were in Blackdom Township, Township, besides farming? And was the township self-sustaining?
Self-sustaining. Okay. Individually, Blackdomites could not sustain themselves. Collectively, they could. So what would happen is droughts are going to happen in New Mexico. You need to be prepared for it. So they had a scheme, a plan that if there's not enough water, you either work on someone else's homestead or you go into Roswell as a domestic. So this is where the philosophical part comes in. They go past the Du Boisian veil of Blackdom, or the corporate veil of Blackdom, and then enter into Roswell as a domestic, as they would go into the trains as porters, but most of the time they were field hands on other people's homesteads or other larger ranches. When people came into Blackdom from wherever, Mississippi, wherever, there was usually a host family, and that would last until someone established the paperwork for their homestead. And even then, it was still just desert prairie. So there was usually a mentorship, of course, a lot of religious study, and Freemasonry. So the whole notion of alchemy was within the ether of what they did. So I don't know if that answers your question. I just started thinking about how families survived. Sometimes there was a store, there was a general store, there was a post office. So yeah, it wasn't self-sustaining individually, but collectively it was in different ways. And the way that they sustained was sometimes working on someone else's land or wherever they can get a job. That's why it was so easy to transition to Roswell when they went to oil exploration, because it was already a part of what they did. It was just their duality. They were able to transition from being mayor or what do they call him, peace officer, into and going into Roswell and being a maid. They were able to, have that duality.
Thank you. So the next question is, and I have a list, so I'm going down the list here. And Cindy Bancroft is asking, can you talk about the no sir answer on the form?
Oh, thank you. Okay, so all right. So when I say the lost years, in my dissertation, I describe the atmosphere. So now it's something I call the Talmadge affair. So there were two brothers from Chicago who were very wealthy, and they were a part of the railroads. And so you have the Santa Fe Railroad coming in. There's already Hagerman, who was an industrialist from Colorado. He came to southeastern New Mexico, created the largest irrigation project, at the time and ever at that time. So you had a lot of industrialists flock to southeastern New Mexico. It was a major economic hub. And Roswell was the hub of Chavez County, which was the hub in Pecos Valley region. So wealthy industrialists. Well, let me make sure. What's the question again?
The question is. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my spot here. Oh, can you talk about the no sir answer on the form?
Okay, so for Isaac Jones, who was the vice president, to say no sir in 1905, and they had the incorporation of the Blackdom town site in 1903, that meant that Blackdom didn't exist. So why would the vice president of the company connected to a town put no sir? Well, here's why. Before Blackdom, Isaac Jones was already in New Mexico and the railroads were coming. And so there was a railroad scheme where they would get homesteaders to get free land, and then they would buy it from them at a cheaper price than they would. Also, there was a law so there was a law, you couldn't just be a railroad and then gather up a whole bunch of land. So they could use people, especially black people who were colonizing all the time. If there was a large enough scheme, they could then get the land from the black people. And I think Isaac Jones was kind of a part of that part because he disappeared after 1905. So he doesn't appear on record again. So the no sir part was, I think he was more a part of the scheme of Blackdom rather than having the mentality of a Blackdomite. So that's where the no sir comes from. I think he was part of the scheme.
And people seem to be very interested in the t-shirts and the Bible schools.
Yes. Okay, so because I haven't taught, right? I haven't taught, or I haven't had a job. I've taught a lot, but I haven't had a job at an institution. I'm in New Mexico, where there's not a single African American Studies department at all, and there's maybe 3 programs. So there's no actually tenure track. So there are very few black scholars in black studies or in blacks in the West, or however. There's none of that. There's just Borderland Studies, and that's kind of what I've gone through. So I could get a job in Borderland Studies, but my emphasis would be black studies. And so at UNI, University of New Mexico, I did start teaching there, but again, it was part-time. So I decided that I would take the inspiration from Blackdomites and build my own institution. So this represents the first inaugural shirt of Blackdom University. Seriously. And Blackdom Townsite Company, my partner and I, we co-founded or resurrected the Blackdom Townsite Company in 1919, or in 2019. Yes, September of 2019, and that becomes the nonprofit where we're able to do intersectionality training and stuff like that. So so the shirt and the mug and things like that are the way that we try to fund what we do, because while I look for a job. So yeah, that's really
have a public history element to it too, right?
And I'm also an artist, so I kind of wanted to do it anyway. That's really what it was.
So Marissa has a question, and she wants to know why you are talking about MIDI more.
Oh, okay. All right. So I wrote a screenplay, okay, that was for a Netflix series. Now, I don't know if you have watched Godless, the next Netflix series, but they mention Blackdom in that series. So I want you to watch it just so that you could see why I created a new series. Basically, they kill everybody in the place they call Blackdom. They kill all the black folks except for one young woman. Yes. So I created a screenplay and it became a concept trailer. I could show you if you want. I don't know if I can show you here. I don't think I could pull it in. But concept trailer, and it's on it. Well, it's possible to get a Netflix series afterwards if anyone decided to. But she kind of bridges the gap that for people when I talk about Blackdom. Because I talk about Blackdom as not just a place but an idea, and her being a bootlegger, a madam, and so many other things that Blackdomites didn't want, she still saw homesteading near Blackdom as important. So there's it allows people to see that she wasn't just the gunslinger, you know. So that's why I talk about MIDI a lot, and also I want to do a TV series based on her.
Thank you. Josh, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi. I'm Josh.
Hi.
So, something that I found was really interesting was you focused on kind of their understanding of they wanted to create sustainability through dry farming. However, you also acknowledged the inability for complete sustainability. So there was like a dependence on Roswell. So if what I thought was really interesting was when you talked about the understanding of I forgot who it was, the founder.
Boyer.
Yeah, he went to establish kind of an understanding of a freedom, and how farming and the lack of an ability of sustainability, if that makes sense,
Yes.
kind of into how he's thinking about Du Boisian double consciousness. If you want to just talk about that, because that sounds really, really interesting to me, and there's a lot of tension.
Oh yes. Okay. So for me, um, um, the double consciousness you have to be both sovereign in Blackdom and then go into Roswell required a certain flexibility. It required a certain intellectual capacity that a lot of people didn't have. I'll just give you this story, all right? I'll give you his name in a minute, but one of the original founders of Blackdom, I can't think of his, Hubert. Hubert is his name. I'll get his whole name in a minute. Hubert. So he signs the Articles of Incorporation in 1903, goes home, and in 1910, he has 3 kids and he's a cook. You go to the census record in 1920, he has 7 kids and he's still a cook. Now, imagine he's in Roswell, he has a home, he hasn't left in 20 years, and his family is growing. But you can see that Blackdom is a scheme out there that isn't really working for many people. It doesn't work until 1920. So what I want you to imagine is the consciousness he had to have when he opened up the newspaper in 1920 and it said, "Will drill at Blackdom." Basically, he decided to exist on the other side of the Du Boisian Veil where he was only a cook. And it didn't allow him to take advantage of what happened on the other side of the Du Boisian Veil, where black people reached their maximum potential in the West, which is striking oil in 1919. I mean, you're talking about the start of the Roaring 20s. You're talking about, so that was a part of the consciousness. Now, a part of it also was a belief in it. In Blackdom, they believed in the church. They believed in the Holy Ghost and all of the things of the church. That was clear. However, someone like Mitty, maybe, maybe not, but she definitely did not apply them to her life. So you can see the duality in Mitty and Ella, because both of them end up switching places. When Ella left with the rest of the family and went to Vado, Mitty moved in because she had a whole square mile. She moved from Roswell. But Ella went to Roswell first, when they were during World War II. So you could see that there's this constant switching. But then when Mitty tried to enter into the community for real, she was gone. So she broke the consciousness because she was a bootlegger, a well-known bootlegger, and so on and so on. They didn't. This was really against the alcohol too. So yeah, there was a. They understood blackness, but they understood just being black wasn't enough. You had to have a sincere understanding of what goes on the inside versus the outside. I hope I answered your question.
Thanks, Josh. Cindy is curious, what remains physically of the settlement, if anything?
There is basically a few foundations. That's it. If you look from aerial views, you could see where some of the oil rigs were, but that's because it's a hole, and the way that they used to drill was brutal. I mean, they just blow things up, and so you could see the blast still there now. So there's not much there at all. There was talk of a memorial, and money fell through, but there's not much there at all right now. All we have are the lives that are on record. And here's the thing. They did it on purpose. So I'll give you an example of how on purpose they did in putting themselves on record. This is what I mean by projecting intersectional blackness. Even though the Blackdom faithful left, migrated outward after 1919 in oil exploration, before leaving, Ella and Frank, and I talked about George Malone, the first black man to argue his case in front of the Supreme Court. He was the notary. They platted the town. This was after they got contracts. So they could have just left if they, really didn't want to deal with Mitty, but they stayed longer to make sure that they were on record because they left their kids there. Like some of the kids that went to war, they stayed in Roswell because they had homesteads in Blackdom, and they kind of ran the business and so on. So.
Thank you. Ryan Roberts, he wants to ask, or he's asking, how does Blackdom speak to the present? In answering this question, pretend you are speaking to Mike Pence.
Oh,
thank you.
I'm going to bring a fly swatter with me if I'm going to talk to Mike Pence. No. If you have black people on horses in Compton, you might want to rethink this race thing. Because, like I said, it's more of an internal society. Black cowboys in Compton, you see them on the outskirts. You see them off of Greenleaf. I can get into the direction, but today, black people are coming together in a way that they haven't before because of the pressure similar to 1919. So there's an intersectional blackness that's going on that's bringing black cowboys together with black gangsters. And now you have black cowboy gangsters at the same time. And I mean gangster in the regular way, not in the they're going to be on horseback shooting drive-bys now. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that it's not separate anymore, and because they feel it's important to get together with whomever is against the force that is against us, that's killing us. I mean, 8 minutes and 48 seconds for George Floyd. Black cowboys are going to be out there, and you have to watch out because these black cowboys are still cowboys. And you're asking people who normally don't show up to show up how they show up. In other words, you're preventing um, a whole new kind of riot, a whole new kind of um, resistance. So the resistance today is the same as before, where you see Blackdom as the place of intention. However, like I said, when it's switched to local power, Black people became even more insular. So, Mike Pence, if you want to get the Black vote, you're going to have to do a little bit better in what you support, like kids in cages. Again, I don't have my fly swatter, so it's kind of hard to talk to Mike Pence without it.
Caleb, who is a student, a history major, is asking, you may have already answered this, but how did you fill in the gaps of your presentation in regards to the missing or silenced people of Blackdom?
The silent people of Blackdom, the way that I fill in the blank is Afro-Frontierism. So I have record of pretty much most of the people who were part of the scheme, because it had to do with homestead records, census records, and so on. But I am now finding the outskirts, the people who didn't quite finish their homestead, and I put them under the rubric of Afro-Frontierist instead of Exoduster, because it's a postscript to freedom. So you have up from slavery. That's Booker T. Washington, right? Up from slavery, or from slavery to freedom. That's Skip Gates at Harvard. So there's all these to freedom. Well, what do you do when you get to freedom? No one talk. Well, few talk about that. So I try to give them voice by considering them as people looking for something beyond freedom, which is in what I call sovereignty. Oh, and just to speak on sovereignty real quick, Mitty was one of the ones who really understood sovereignty. So in 1915, see, this is before she was on trial for attempted murder, 2 years prior, in fact. She was on she was on trial, and it went to the Supreme Court. So she was on trial for prostitution, but she said, "No, you all are violating my sovereignty." So she went to court, and it went all the way to the New Mexico Supreme Court, and it was, let me get the right phrasing, it was called something of the sovereign. It's a phrase. It's like interrupting the sovereign, or disrespecting the sovereign, or something like that. But she was claiming that I'm sovereign and you can't tell me what to do with my body. I can't remember what the title of the language that she used, but yeah. So sovereignty was important. That's the postscript.
Any final questions? Pam, when thinking about the founding history of Black Wall Street, how do these histories intersect?
Okay, so they learned from one another. So best practices were in place in Blackdom. In fact, Blackdom was kind of an underground railroad for the people getting lynched in Oklahoma. The NAACP already knew of it too. So porters would actually, people who were running away from whatever violence, and I can show you one of the cases. I think her name was Nelson. She was lynched, and then they were going to lynch her brother. And so, the word got back to Blackdom that they needed to prepare to send somebody to Mexico, and that's literally what they did to get them out of the country. So they were all connected. If you look in the Crisis magazine, or if you look in the major publications, you'll see that they're talking across great distances. So their intersection was not just that they started a colony, it was more of Freemasonry, So you would listen to lectures and all of the other things that go along with Freemasonry. And that would be the camaraderie, because you would go from one town to another as a Black person. And then that would be kind of the group that enters you into the equation. One thing on the Black Wall Street. So it was burned down, right? As soon as Blackdomites went to oil exploration and it was clear that they were going to get paid, they melted into Roswell. That's how you can get from a Black Wall Street being burnt down to having oil royalties all the way into World War II and that's what happened with Blackdom. The Blackdomites had oil royalties that extended at least until 1947. Also, it was on purpose. That's the other part. It was intentional. There was an intentional leaving things loose enough for them to travel, because they created the corporate veil, and that's really what they were using. That's how you could have Blackdom existing with few people in Blackdom, if any, and most of the people in Roswell. They used the corporate veil.
Brian is asking what is the name of the interview. He wants to look it up in Google. So
interview
to Brian, that'd be great.
Interview with what's the name?
Can you clarify, Dr.?
Oh, on PBS. Oh, on PBS. Oh, okay. Uncovering New Mexico's Blackdom, a production by New Mexico PBS Colotis. And it's on YouTube too. But New Mexico PBS, Blackdom, you're going to get a few things, but the link is now in the chat that I can now see.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I can go all day.
I feel it, man. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nelson. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
This was a very informative discussion, presentation as well. And I really appreciate, we all really appreciate your time, and especially to see a former UNI graduate succeeding so well and doing something that is passionate to you is also very inspiring. I'm sure our students will definitely remember this. Just so everybody knows, this was recorded. So if you would like to go back to back to the presentation and listen to something that maybe you were interested in or like to contact Dr. Nelson, please feel free to email the history department or Dr. Nelson himself.
Oh, I am everywhere. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Medium,
FBI file.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, look, they know who I am, so I don't even worry about it no more.
Yeah. So we would like to, again, thank you for your time, and I'm sure, we look forward to, I definitely look forward to learning more and about your research, about where this goes, and the contributions that you're making, obviously, to the historiography of something that is definitely very relevant, not only just because of the circumstances today, but in general, right? Unearthing these voices, these invisible history, right? That is so important. So thanks again. Thank you everybody for attending. We had a great group. Some people texted me, emailed me, telling me that they had to kind of step away because for other things. So I appreciate your time, and please keep an eye out for other presentations that are going to take place that are sponsored by the History Department and the History Club. So that all that information you can find on our website, in the History Department website at the University of Northern Iowa. So thank you all again. Have a good night. And it's getting chilly out there, which is great for me, but I know not for a lot of you, a lot of other people, other colleagues and friends as well. So thanks a lot. Have a good night, and thank you